With that being said, we'll get started with the introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Martha. I'm a member of AFSC Roots for Peace, a partner organization with ACT LA. Roots for Peace aims to serve the South LA community through food justice programs at our community farm and empower youth by providing a diverse historical lens of community organizing in order to prepare our youth to advocate for their communities. We are so excited to be here today to get us started on this very important conversation on transit justice in Los Angeles. So we are Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles, ACT LA. We are a county-wide coalition for over 40 member organizations focusing on equitable development and transit justice. We are here today because of our transit justice vision that includes Universal Fareless Transit. We're just going to go over some of our great member organizations involved with making this forum happen. Our SAGE, CPC, a lot of CPC folks in the chat, ACLU, Kiwa, and many more. Please keep shouting out in the chat your org in the chat box so we can show you some love, and we'll keep going. In today's town hall discussion, we hope to achieve a couple objectives. Here's the slide on objectives. We're just going to read this over real quick. Some of our objectives include demystifying fareless transit, understanding benefits and feasibility, diving deep into the Fareless Report, and building community and popular support. Should I hand this over to Javi to interpret?
No, Javi is interpreting simultaneously.
Okay, yeah. Awesome. Okay. And moving on to slide 4, we also have a comprehensive agenda today that will hopefully help us achieve the goals we've laid out. Some of the things in our agenda include the welcome, and vision, number 3, metro funding, number 4, deep dive of the report, number 5, a panel discussion, 6, joining us for our advocacy plan, and a closeout at the end. And with that being said, thank you again, everyone, for making the time to tune in today. And I'll actually pass it over to Carmina to get us started with a quick overview of the history of our Metro as a Sanctuary campaign.
No está Monse. Dígale a Monse que le mande el enlace.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carmina Calderon. I'm the Campaigns and Outreach Manager at ACT LA. ACT LA is a coalition of 44 organizations that strives to create just and equitable, sustainable transit systems in neighborhoods, placing the interests of low-income communities first as we create a more sustainable region. Groups in ACT LA have long been organizing tenants, but when ACT LA got the same groups together in 2017 to focus on transit, we did lots of narrative work with organizers and bus riders to describe our North Star, which is our ultimate goal for public transit in LA. So if you could just jump to the timeline slide. Thanks for bearing with us, y'all. So to give a quick overview, back in 2017, we were meeting and campaign planning with our base orgs and community members to really plan out the next 5-10 years of the work that we wanted to do. And in 2018, we did some more narrative building and built out our vision. That's when our Metro as a Sanctuary vision was born. And I'll come back to that in a second. And as part of this work in 2019, we actually held our first metro station activation on the Silver Line. And then as we know, in 2020, we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result, Metro also stopped collecting fares on its buses as a COVID-19 safety precaution. And at the same time too, we released the Metro as a Sanctuary Reimagining Safety on Public Transit report. Since we switched to virtual, in 2020 was also the first time we held our Metro as a Sanctuary Town Hall. And throughout 2021, we did a series of delegations. We had a lot of leadership building with our base orgs. We even had a transit camp at a community garden where we continued to build leadership with our base members. In 2022, Metro reinstated the fare collection on buses, and in the same year, we also activated the Compton Metro Station in September to illustrate how we can create care-based safety on transit. And then we also successfully organized and advocated against a fare hike at Metro. In 2023, Metro launches its Transit Ambassador Program, and then SAGE and ACT LA released the Road to Transit Equity, the case for Universal Fareless Transit in Los Angeles. That's why we are here. So these are just kind of the basic highlights that we've had throughout the years. Obviously, there's been so much other work, but we just wanted to give folks a little overview of how we've gotten to this point. Next slide, please. And so we arrived at this vision that I mentioned earlier, right? That Metro, that our community members helped us arrive at, and it's Metro as a sanctuary. And Metro is a sanctuary for the public. The train and bus are fareless, and consciously part of the region and integrated into people's daily lives and neighborhoods. Metro serves the public as libraries do, a public system where people go to feel safe, access information, and receive a high level of service. And Metro feels honored to serve youth of color and be a resource for all. Los Angeles is proud of how we have embraced a healthy, community-serving, world-class transit system. And so how do we get there, right? We have broken down this vision into 3 campaign goals, which are fareless transit, better bus service, and investing in care-based safety models by divesting from policing. And we know that at the height of the pandemic, lots of our community members were part of those essential workers that didn't have the luxury of working from home. And at the same time, we had urged Metro not to charge fares, right, as a COVID safety precaution. So for 22 months, I'll slow down. For 22 months, Los Angeles Metro, well, the bus was fare free. And at the beginning of 2022, Metro voted to resume fares. Last summer, we went out with community members to survey transit riders at transit hubs in the East Side and South Central to interview folks and survey them about the impact that this had on them and their families. And then we had focus groups on the topic, and eventually all of this went into this review committee and other folks that contributed to this wonderful report that we're going over today. But before we get to the report, I'll pass it to Tala to give us a general overview on Metro's finances.
Thank you, Carmina. I'm Tala Oskai. I'm a researcher with ACT LA, and like Carmina said, I'm just going to give us a primer on how Metro funding works. So if we could go to the next slide. Yeah, and then the next one there, yeah. So a common misperception is that fares constitute a huge portion of Metro's revenue sources. This is actually true in other places like New York City, where the MTA depends on fares for about 25% to 40% of its budget, but it's not true in Los Angeles with Metro. So according to Metro's fiscal year 24 budget, Fares are estimated to earn Metro $146.8 million this year, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually less than 2% of Metro's annual budget. The majority, more than 60% of Metro's funding, comes from sales tax and state and federal funding. That means every time that we buy something and pay our annual taxes, we are already paying for public transit. Next slide, please. There are 4 major sales taxes that make up a large part of Metro's funds, and these come from Proposition A, Proposition C, Measure R, and Measure M. All of these measures have restrictions on how this money can be spent, with specific allocations for categories like rail, highways, and funds for local municipal operators. But there are also allocations for operations from these measures where the budget for a Fareless program could come from. And 40% of Proposition A and C are discretionary, which means they can be allocated for whatever purpose. Metro doesn't always maximize the discretionary funds from these measures and other revenue for the operations budget specifically. So there could be wiggle room in these resources to cover the losses in fare revenue if Metro got creative. The remainder of Metro's revenues come from state transit funding and grants, and a small amount comes from operating revenues, which are things like advertising, tolls, and fares. Metro already gets a lot of grants and earmarks for capital infrastructure for projects like rail, so it could and should be prioritizing discretionary and other funds with more flexibility for operations. If Metro were to maximize its discretionary funds and earmarks for operations and could still not account for the small pot of fare revenues that would be lost from going fareless, it would need to engage in advocacy to remove the earmarks or find new sources of funding. However, next slide, please. However, the operations portion of Metro's budget is actually very sizable, and it also has wiggle room for a universal fareless system. At $2.3 billion per year, the operations budget is the part Metro uses to run Metro buses and trains, as well as pay for service-related costs such as cleaning, tap infrastructure, and law enforcement. Next slide, please. So the breakdown of the operations by transit mode is visualized here.
Slow down a bit, Tala.
Oh,
Slow
sorry.
down. No worries.
Yeah, so this is the breakdown of the operations budget by transit mode. So you have 65% of the revenue, that $2 billion, going to buses, where ridership is highest, 34% on rail, and about 1% on a rideshare service called Metro Micro. And even though bus spending makes up the majority of operations spending, this allocation doesn't not fully track with actual ridership, where bus boardings make up of about 80% of all boardings on Metro. So they are not spending in an amount that matches how Metro Transit is actually being utilized. Furthermore, despite increased spending on bus service has actually gotten worse over the years because buses lack priority in roadways where traffic continues to worsen. Next slide, please. Within the operations budget itself, Metro spends $290 million on public safety initiatives. $45 million of this is spent on novel alternative safety models like the Transit Ambassador Program and mental health outreach. But most of this, $245 million, is spent on contracted and in-house police and security. Note that this amount involves the labor costs of fare enforcement and work that is duplicated by non-contracted local law enforcement and emergency services, who are also obligated to respond to safety issues on Metro. The cost of a universal fareless program to Metro then, that is like it would be lost fare revenue, that would be the cost, would actually be a smaller fraction of the operations budget than the fraction of the operations budget currently being used by law enforcement. Furthermore, as Chelsea will explain further when she starts to cover the report, the majority of fare revenues are immediately lost to the costs of maintaining and enforcing a fare system. So to illustrate the possibility, if Metro were to eliminate TAP infrastructure and cut police spending by half, then Metro could run a universal fareless system. But that's just an example. That is not the only way the budget could be restructured to allow for fareless. So the major takeaway here is that Metro has ample resources, but they are not always organized and used in the most efficient and equitable way. So I'm going to pass it to Chelsea now, who's going to do the deep dive into the report.
Chelsea, before you start, can we do another quick interpretation announcement? I don't know if the interpreters are available. Javi or Naida. Just a quick, I saw some new folks join in.
Solamente les recordamos cómo acceder a la función de interpretación, si prefieren el español o el inglés. Si no son completamente bilingües en ambos idiomas, necesitamos que se conecten a el canal de idiomas en el globo terráqueo y de una computadora, pero si están conectados de un dispositivo móvil, pueden hacerlo deslizando hacia la izquierda los 3 puntitos y ahí van las mismas opciones. A quick reminder that if you are not fully bilingual in English and Spanish, that you do need to connect to a language channel, and the way you do that from my computer is through the globe at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're connected from a mobile device, you will do this through sliding your bottom menu to the left to see a 3-dot menu, and you will see these options for language interpretation there as well. Thank you. If you need any support, let us know in the chat. Si necesita ayuda, por favor, avísenos por el chat. Gracias.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Can we advance the slide, please? I'm Chelsea Kirk. I'm a researcher with SAGE, and I'm one of the authors of our recent report, The Road to Transit Equity, the Case for Universal Fareless Transit in Los Angeles. And this report, it really examines the feasibility of fareless transit in Los Angeles and its potential to deliver equity and affordability to riders of LA Metro. And so today we're going to go over some of the high-level findings, but we're really only going to touch the surface. So we're also going to drop the report in the chat and hope you'll give a read. Next slide, please. So to start, what do we mean when we say universal fareless transit? So ACT LA, we imagine universal fareless transit as a system-wide policy that would allow the public to ride LA Metro buses, subways, light rail, and shuttles without having to pay a fare. Next slide. And so one of the main questions we're answering in this report is, why should LA Metro implement this kind of system? Why should we go fareless? Next slide. And so one major reason is that, riders are really struggling right now, and this policy would benefit them immensely. And so as part of this report, we talked to bus riders in South and East Los Angeles in focus groups to really learn how they felt about Metro's current fare structure. And what we learned is pretty significant. Next slide. So 1, we learned that LA Metro riders are struggling to meet expenses and are not well served by the agency's discount programs. We also learned, go back, please. Sorry. We also learned that riders often have to reduce or forego their use of public transportation to be able to afford other necessities. Next. We learned that LA Metro's fare collection system causes riders to be in conflict with bus drivers and law enforcement, and that fares are limiting riders' access to social and financial opportunities, and that eliminating fares will bring significant economic relief to riders. Next slide. And so when we talk about Metro riders, who are we talking about? Who are the folks that would really benefit from fareless transit? So unlike other public transit agencies in other large cities like New York and Chicago, LA Metro's ridership is primarily made up of people who, don't have access to a car, are low income, and are mostly people of color. As you can see on the pie chart, about 75% of riders of LA Metro are either Latinx or Black. Next slide. And moreover, around 62% of Metro's riders are earning less than $25,000 a year in income. And so if you're earning this little in income on an annual basis, you are almost certainly burdened by the region's high housing and transportation costs. And as we heard from riders that we talked to for this report, LA Metro's fares aren't affordable when one is earning so little and taking the bus so much. Next slide. And so Metro's solution to this issue of affordability has been discount programs, such as the LIFE program for low-income riders and the Go Pass program for students. I'm going to slow down a little bit just to make sure interpreters are able to catch up. And so, Metro actually invests a significant amount of funding in these discount programs, around $6 million a year, and yet enrollment remains low. And so these programs aren't really reaching those who need them. And for example, as of fall of last year, only 33% of eligible riders for the LIFE program, which is the low income discount program, were actually enrolled in that program. And when we talked to riders, we heard that there are several reasons why these programs aren't reaching them. Some of those reasons include that, qualifying riders actually don't even know that the programs exist. Others don't have the technology to be able to apply. They either don't have computers or they don't have internet at home. Some said they don't know where or how to apply. Others, especially undocumented folks, are not comfortable giving over personal information to a government agency. And then another often overlooked challenge that really undermines the effectiveness of these programs is that 28% of Metro riders are paying in cash. And so we're really underestimating how many people in LA do not have access to a bank account or a card. And so these limitations are really highlighting the need for alternative approaches to making sure that riders have access to affordable transit. And that is definitely something that Fareless would achieve. So Fareless will also alleviate transportation burden. And when I'm referring to transportation burden, what I mean is it's when a household is spending over 15% of their income on transportation. And in LA County, a stunning 84% of residents are transportation burdened. And this is actually the second largest expense after housing. And so for those who rely on LA Metro to get around, eliminating fares provides immediate financial relief. Riders can save money that they would otherwise allocate for transportation and actually use those resources towards other essential needs, such as food, housing, and healthcare. And in this way, Fareless is acting, like an economic stimulus, especially when we consider that families are still recovering from COVID-19 job loss. Many are grappling with rising housing costs and rising inflation. Next slide, please. So Fareless Transit will also increase the mobility and access of its riders. When riders are transportation burdened, as many Metro riders are, they use transit less in order to save money. And as a result, they're losing access to all this city has to offer. They're losing access to jobs, to educational opportunities, to good food stores, healthcare, green space. They don't do as many social activities, and important resources become out of reach. Now, in a world where, or in a city where we have fareless transit, when riders don't need to worry about the cost of fares, they don't have to worry about whether money is on their tap card. Individuals can freely and conveniently travel to and from locations without any financial constraint. And this ensures that they can actually access what they need and take advantage of all the city's offerings. Next slide, please. So it'll also increase ridership, which in turn increases safety, which is a huge concern of Metro staff that we hear time and time again. So studies consistently show that when cities go fareless, they experience a substantial increase in ridership, ranging from 20% to 60%, and in some cases, even up to 200%. Let's take Kansas City as an example. 8 months after they implemented fareless transit, they saw a 38% increase in ridership. And what these increases in ridership result in are more populated buses, trains, stations, and stops. And this increased presence of more people on the transit system enhances safety. This is a concept we call more eyes on the street. And so when there are more people in our bus stops or in the buses, in the train station, the system is becoming better monitored by passengers. Moreover, another thing to note is that disputes on transit systems are often over fares. Bus operators get into disagreements and arguments that can escalate with riders who can't pay fares or who are being demanded to pay fares. And so when we look again at Kansas City, which is the largest city in the United States to implement fareless, we find that a year after they went fareless, they saw a 39% decrease in crime incidents on the transit system. And this was attributed to the elimination of fare-related disputes. Next slide, please. And one thing we know for sure is that fareless transit does improve quality of life for riders. And in LA, it's already proven that it has. So if you all remember, in April of 2020, shortly after COVID-19, and until January 2022, for almost 2 years, Metro eliminated fare collection on their bus system. And so in effect, Metro has already operated a de facto fareless program. So for part of this report, we decided to survey bus riders, and we wanted to know about their experience during the fareless transit program of LA Metro during that time period. And the responses we got back, which you'll see on the slide, indicated that riders experience greater mobility and a higher quality of life, diminished stress when fares are eliminated. And so I'm gonna kind of review what we heard. So here's what riders reported. 74% said that during Metro's fareless program, they used the bus more often. 80% said that they had more money to spend on other essential needs. 89% said that they felt less stressed out about how to pay for the bus. 88% said they found it easier to keep doctor's appointments. 84% found it was easier to travel to work or school. 65% said that they visited places that they don't typically visit. So they were going to new parts of the city that otherwise they probably wouldn't have. 78% said that they rode the bus more often to attend social activities, such as seeing friends or family. And 80% said that they used the bus more often to shop for groceries or run important errands. Next slide, please. And so not only should Metro go fareless because of the clear equity benefits that its riders would receive, but they can go fareless. LA Metro is a massive and intricate transit system with an $8.8 billion budget, and it really differentiates itself from other major transit agencies in terms of how it's funded, which is a bit of what Tala touched on. Next slide, please. And so I'm really going to reiterate this funding piece because it's really important for this conversation. While many large transit systems rely heavily on fare revenues to sustain operations, LA Metro's funding is mostly coming from taxpayer dollars. So all of us are already paying for LA Metro. If we look on the slide, what we'll see is that, last fiscal year, 2023, only 5% of Metro's operating budget actually came from fare revenues. And we call this percentage, this is something called the fare box recovery ratio, and it's the portion of operating expenses covered by fares. So next slide, please. And so to give you a sort of sense of like other transit systems, fare revenue sources, what you'll see is, if we look at, this is fiscal year 2019, this was kind of prior to COVID-19, pre any sort of impact. And you'll see that comparatively, LA has a very low fare box recovery ratio compared to other similarly large transit systems like New York and Chicago. So you'll see that, where 53% of New York's operations were paid for by fares in 2019, only 15% of the operations of LA's operations were covered by fares. So you have in New York, over half of their system is paid for by fares, and that's just never been the case in LA. Next slide, please. So here's just another visual of that. Fares just make up a really small piece of the funding pie. Next slide. Next slide, please. And so why is this important? So having a low fare box recovery ratio positions an agency like LA Metro to adopt a fareless system because the agency is not relying on fares to sustain itself. And historically, cities that have gone fareless have had low fare box recovery ratios prior to eliminating fares. So if we take Kansas City, for example, the year before they implemented Fareless, they had a 10% fare box recovery ratio. In Albuquerque, they had a 7%. As I said, for LA Metro, in fiscal year 2023, we had a 5%. So we have an even lower fare box recovery ratio than cities that have already gone fareless. Next slide, please. And so not only do fares not fund the system, but they are costly to maintain. It is expensive to run a TAP system, to even collect fares to begin with. And so what do I mean by that? It might not be obvious, but operating a fare system requires various different components that can be very expensive. There's the cost of tap cards, equipment to dispense and read tap cards. I'm talking about, those ticket vending machines where you pay for your tap card, fare gates, card readers. There's also administering fares, which means, staff time to create and process any applications for discount programs, to do outreach and marketing to get more people to use tap cards. And there's also the maintenance required for all of this equipment. There's staff time to evaluate, how effective are these fare systems? And then there's the cost of enforcement, which is significant. And this is paying officers to do audits and give citations. And so when we talk about Fareless, we often don't talk about these costs. We talk about what we lose rather than what we would save. But when we look at LA Metro's TAP system costs, we find that there would be significant cost savings were the agency to go Fareless. So let's break it down a bit. I have some figures on the screen. And so we're looking here at fiscal year 2023. And what we see is that Metro collected $106.5 million in fare revenues. But as you see, they also spend close to $80 million on activities related to the fare system. And so when you take what Metro earns and you compare it to what is spent, the total that Metro actually collects in net revenue is closer to $30 million. That is less than 1% of Metro's budget. And that means that 75% of fare revenues are used to maintain and enforce the system. So we can absolutely afford to go fareless. So next slide, please. So to conclude, LA Metro is uniquely positioned to go fareless because of their funding structure and their ridership demographics. And doing so would streamline LA Metro's operations budget. It would increase ridership, it would improve safety, and it would help the agency achieve its equity goals. So in short, going fareless just makes sense. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Chelsea, for that deep dive into the report. We know that was a lot of information for everyone. From the history of the report, of the work, down to how Metro gets its funding, and then the report. So we're wondering if we could give folks a quick break, like a 5-minute bio break to go to the bathroom, or if you're in transit, stick around. Get a glass of water if you can, but we'll be back in 5 minutes. That would put us at 6:49. So yeah, we have a break slide. Scarlett, if you could put it up. We'll be back at 6:49, 6:50. Hey folks, sorry for that abrupt stop, but it is 6:50 and we're back. We're gonna get started with our panel discussion. I'll pass it off to Marissa, who's going to be our moderator. And yeah, we'll get started on the panel. And shout outs to DJ Que Madre for the transit playlist. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you to our 3 panelists for joining us. It's really great to have different perspectives and types of expertise around transit. So I'm going to start with an introductory question. This is for everyone, and we'll go in order. that's on the screen. So Isabel, you can answer first, and then Osceola, and then Adonia. The question is, can you introduce yourself, tell us your name and your organization, and then let us know when you kind of heard about the vision for a fareless system for the first time and how long you've been involved in that work. And so I'll pass it to Isabel whenever you're ready.
Isabel, are you there? Maybe you can start with the next person, Marissa, and Oscar, maybe you can text Isabel.
Yeah, that works. Why don't we just reverse the order? So starting with Adonia.
Sure. Okay, can you all hear me? All right. I'm glad to be here. Love being in this space with so many familiar folks. It is always a good environment to be talking about transit with ACT LA and SAGE, all the other groups who are part of this conversation. I'm Adonia Lugo. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And I live in South LA, traditional and unceded Tongva territory. I am here wearing a few hats. I'm here, I work for the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and I also am a member of the California Transportation Commission. And I think I'll explain a little bit more about that when I answer another question later on. But in terms of when I first heard about Fareless, honestly, I feel like it's not an idea I had encountered really directly, just, living in big cities in the US. I've lived in LA and Seattle and Washington, DC, Portland, not as big a city. There were areas up in the Pacific Northwest that had like Fareless squares when I lived there, but those were getting eliminated. And so, when I heard about this work that you all were doing around investigating Fareless as an option, I was just really excited to hear about it. I did get to participate in some of the transit as sanctuary work early on when I was on the advisory board for People for Mobility Justice. So I have been, seeing the overall values framework that has been created, and just love seeing the work on Fareless that's coming out now.
Thank you, Adonia. And we'll pass it to Osceola now.
Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Osceola Sankara, he, him pronouns. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you from LA, where I am a legal fellow at the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California. And I work with our economic justice and police practices teams on many things mostly related to transportation related enforcement. And ACLU SoCal is a proud member of the ACT LA Coalition. And it's, like I said, a pleasure to be here, learning from you all, chatting with you all about this really important policy initiative, Universal Fare-Free Transit. I first heard about fare-free transit, I want to say, maybe in the context of campaigns for student passes, led by the Bus Riders Union. And this was in like 2013, 2014. The BRU was finding that the majority of youth referrals to the juvenile justice system in LA County was over fare evasion citations. And in fact, fare evasion citations were like we're the largest category of youth ticketing. And so as part of the campaign pushing against that, the strategy center was calling for, I believe, fareless transit for students. But the universal fareless demand, and before that, I see in the chat, BRU had a no seat, no fare campaign. Right, great point. So pushing back against overcrowding and calling it out. Why are we paying for something when the agency is, not treating riders with respect and investing in the service the riders deserve? In terms of like recently, I think I heard about it again from folks within Metro, and Phil Washington brought it up, former CEO of Metro. I think one of his staff members was trying to make a business campaign for why a business argument for why Metro could and should eliminate fares as a way to increase ridership, and that it could do it because of the sales tax initiatives and revenue in place.
Thank you, Osceola. That's exciting that you go a full decade back with some history around Fairless. And Isabel, I'll ask the same question. Could you introduce yourself, your name, your organization? And then the question is, when did you first hear about kind of the vision for Fairless Transit? And how long have you been involved with the campaign work to get it passed?
Hola a todas, a todos.
Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Tecum. I live in the city of Watts and I am a member of SAGE since 2009. When I first heard about this Fairless Transit campaign was back in 2017. And I believe the first times, I think, when Osceola and Carmina started the campaign, I remember my son was very young, very small, and we would use the train. We wanted to travel outside of LA, but we couldn't buy tickets because it was just way too expensive. And my son and I would go to the metro station and we would just stand there and look at and wonder when will be the day that metro will be free. That's why when Osceola invited us, we were there. I brought my daughter. I brought an acquaintance. I was so happy, so excited, because I said to myself, finally, we're going to be using the metro with no fees and we can go anywhere we want to go. Sincerely, we don't see that yet until I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were in conversations about wanting a Fairless metro, but that was definitely, I felt like a door. The pandemic arrived and the metro was going to receive some funding to sustain itself, and so the fees were waived, and I was very happy that day. But there were free trains, free buses, but now you couldn't go out anymore. So that was another obstacle. That was the same time exciting and sad because the metro was free, but I couldn't use them. My son was so excited and that we really wanted to use all the trains that were going to be available to us at the station, and we couldn't use them because of the pandemic. Well, that's a little bit about, from what I remember, how I got involved in the first time I heard about the possibility of the metro being free. But I'm sharing this story that started in 2017, in 2019, when and I have been involved since then with the campaign work. And so whenever I hear there's an action regarding free metro, I'm very excited. I hope that today is the day that the trains and the buses will be free of charge. But I think the biggest disappointment is when I continue to fight, and I don't see that that it's free. So
Thank you,
now
Isabel.
it's something that I had not really shared in a long time. How moved I was to be a part of the campaign.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sharing, Isabel. And I think a
Gracias.
lot of people had a
me
similar experience during the times when Metro was fareless, either during the pandemic or when the new line opened, that, you know, suddenly it feels like a door is opened and they could go, you know, move around freely. So thank you for sharing. And now I'm going to ask a question, a different question for each of the individual panelists. And so starting again with Adonia, public transit in LA recently has gotten a lot of negative backlash in popular media, specifically around conceptions of crime, poverty, this concept that there's like an undesirable presence on buses and trains. So can you talk a little about how we got to this place and how you think we can get out of it?
Yeah, sure. I think that what is so frustrating about the way that the hardships people are experiencing on transit gets portrayed is that you know, media can just kind of rely on this nobody likes transit and this confirms why kind of underlying bias. You know, it's like these kinds of stories confirm, and that's why you shouldn't use public transit. Because the thing is, even though there is a crisis going on in this region, we have a long-standing cultural bias against public transportation. And, you know, when I was first learning about sustainable transportation in Los Angeles in about 2008, when I was developing a dissertation project for my PhD in anthropology, and I started learning about the history, it, you know, it came with all this romance. There's this very romantic idea that we used to have streetcars, you know, LA used to have the most extensive streetcar system in the country or in the world. And it's true, there was a very extensive network of, you know, rail. It was privately owned. It was built in order to get people to housing. So it was very mixed up with the whole development of the redlining system, right? In terms of who could live where and who had access to get away from the central city. And then as people started to get more into private automobiles, you know, public opinion and people in power really tried to shift public opinion away from wanting to buy the streetcar systems. Like they could have become public. I think that was something that happened in the 50s. There was that opportunity, or maybe even further back in the 40s. And it just, you know, the public didn't want it. And so what we ended up with is the system we have today, right? Which gets treated like something that is for only those who have no other options. And that's an attitude that has been in place for decades and decades. And I just, you know, I feel like anytime I have the opportunity to talk to somebody about LA transportation history, I really try to burst their bubble. It's like, no, that whole Who Framed Roger Rabbit story, like, oh, we were all so happy on the streetcars. That's not true. White supremacy, that's what was going on, you know. This region has been so shaped by white supremacy culture. And it's weird because we're also minority or majority POC, right? So it can be hard for us to see sometimes the way that these systems that we rely on, these infrastructures like our transportation system, you know, they emerged from a white supremacy culture, and changing them is really challenging. And transportation is an area where we have so many challenges, not just in terms of infrastructure, like a lot of pro-sustainable transportation people like to frame it as infrastructure, like we need more trains, we need more, then people would ride if they had more infrastructure. But the thing is, how have our families and our neighborhoods and our communities been so shaped by thinking that the only way to be safe or the only way to have a good life is being inside a car? And that's such a huge factor in how people feel about public transit today. For folks who have had to struggle and deal with economic insecurity for so long, how are we making public transit? That's why I love the sanctuary concept, because I feel like it connects right there with that. Like, what could we do to actually make our shared social public spaces on transit into these nourishing spaces, right? So that people weren't caught in this kind of like, here's the system you're forced to use until you can afford to get out of it. And then you're just going to be in your car forever, because no looking back, no going back to, where you experienced the oppression. So yeah, I feel like the current media narratives about public transit being this bad space, so many drug overdose deaths, it's violent, it's dangerous. It's just, it's like it sells, right? That's just a narrative, it sells, it's part of the same nobody walks in LA, kind of mentality that so many of us are trying to fight against. But it's also, it's very sad to think that these kinds of crises are just being dismissed as, well, that's public transit for you, instead of helping to build support for action and more intervention.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing some of that context and history. I think there's it's kind of an interesting thing to see as Metro riders when, there will be something like an LA Times article or something published sort of like bemoaning that, like, oh, no one takes Metro and all of these trains and buses are running empty and they're so frightening. And then it's like the next day we get up, go to work, and the trains are full and buses are, passing people by because they're so packed during rush hour. So thank you for talking about that. And then for Osceola, I want to ask, because ACLU often represents marginalized groups that experience discrimination from police and that are heavily impacted by economic burdens. And so how would removing fares change the day-to-day life for those groups?
Thanks, Marissa. I see three big changes that would come about as a result of Metro adopting a universal fareless program. So those would be increases in mode shifting, eliminating fare evasion as a category of enforcement, and improving safety for bus operators. So the first one, and Chelsea touched on this earlier when she was talking about the safety impacts of having more people ride transit, right? In terms of more people out and about, and we keep us safe at the end of the day. I also think it's interesting to note that of all the policies that were analyzed by Metro a few years ago, universal fare-free transit, they found, would decrease vehicle miles traveled the most out of the policies that they compared. And it's important to really never forget the decades, if not centuries, of racist transportation planning decisions that have left Black and Brown communities with the most susceptibility to transportation-related dangers, and today with dangerous streets, right, in LA County are disproportionately located in Black and Brown neighborhoods. Last fiscal year, 866 people were killed in traffic carnage. And so, it's really important for everyone to be thinking about, how do we increase transit ridership and decrease driving and make transit a competitive system so that you can get where you need to go in pretty much as much time or less than it takes to get there in a car. So, math is pretty simple in this one, right? Like, ridership increases dramatically when fares are eliminated. No fares means more bus and train rides. more of those rides means less drives, and fewer drives mean fewer crashes, right? So fare-free transit has major safety benefits. It's a sleeping giant in terms of traffic safety strategies, and I think it's important to kind of name that. Interestingly, a study of Montreal bus lines estimated that around 2,000 lives were saved over 10 years in terms of the mode shift effect, and that study only looked at 10 bus lines. So mode shift is one. The next is fare evasion. And I was just on Expo Line a few weeks ago, coming home late at night. LAPD got on, they stopped the entire train. Like they held the train at the station for like maybe like 7 minutes or something and just checked everybody's fares. I ended up missing my connecting bus, and the next one didn't arrive for another 30, 35 minutes. And I was standing at this deserted bus stop next to this alleyway, and there was like nobody else around, and half of the street lights on the street were broken. So the only light came from this like closed butcher shop across the street. And I'm just sitting there like, Metro Police talk about this as if it's safety, right? The fare evasion stops, the fare evasion enforcement is what keeps us safe. But in reality, it does the exact opposite. I was less safe because I was there in the middle of the night in this dark corner by an alley, and then I just decided to walk home because I could get there, and it was a 30-minute walk versus 35-minute wait for the bus plus another 10-15 minutes on the bus. So that's the current picture of fare enforcement. It's for years, like I mentioned earlier, fare enforcement was the #1 cause of youth referral in LA County to the juvenile justice system. And it's, a common experience in many low-income Black and brown neighborhoods. If you're a kid, to walk out your front door in the morning and just run this gauntlet of police patrols, right? The LAPD in your neighborhood, and you have, the sheriffs or the LAPD or Long Beach PD on public transit, and then you get to school and there's like the school police department and probation. It's just like in every aspect of folks' lives. And then to get home at the end of the day, they have to go through all of the reverse. This kind of thing doesn't keep us safe. And in the context of Metro, so much of this enforcement and transit policing revolves around fare enforcement. Fare enforcement is the bulk of Metro citations and warnings most years, representing, I think, 95% of the total citations and warnings in 2019. And over half of the riders who get them are Black, even though Black people only represent like a quarter of Metro's ridership. So fare enforcement is racist. There's really no way to like equitably do it. You know what I mean? There's no way to like synthesize racial equity and racial injustice. And so eliminating fare collection as just a category of interaction with the law enforcement system would just be such a step in the right direction for LA Metro, for the county, as communities across the county call for criminalization. And last but not least, I think that eliminating fare enforcement would help keep us bus operators safe. That's another question we see. And I think I saw that question in the chat, right? Like, would bus operators be safe from assault without fares? And actually, in most years, the majority of disputes between passengers and riders are over fares. And transit labor leaders, since at least the 1960s, have called for fare collection to be removed from buses for that exact reason. So ATU in 1968 in DC, they led this big famous strike calling for money bait to be removed from the buses. And that campaign spread nationally to cities including LA and the surrounding region. In fact, I want to read this quote. In 1980, the international vice president of ATU said that, and I quote, "Significant permanent reduction of transit crime is likely to come as a result of basic system change. No fare systems and honor systems are the kinds of changes that need to be carefully looked at for their impact." This was like in 1980 at the height, or the onset of the, so-called war on drugs, which, was this completely racist enforcement strategy, led by the extreme right to incarcerate as many poor Black and brown people as possible. And that, a union leader was saying this in 1980, and that this continues to be a challenge, that bus operators are experiencing disputes on the daily with riders over fares. I think is like a clear sign to me that agencies need to take action. And in this case, one of the best ways to, or the way to eliminate this as a source of conflict, as a source of danger for bus operators, is to eliminate fare collection entirely.
Yeah, thank you, Osceola. I think it's interesting to see, it's almost like bus operators sort of have a secondary job, right? Aside from just operating the bus, making sure everyone gets there safely, it's enforcing that everyone who gets on has their fare. And so last, I want to pass it back to Isabel. Thank you for telling us sort of about your personal experiences and your son's experiences with briefly having fareless and the challenges of paying fares. I know that you're an organizer with SAGE and that you do a lot of campaign work there. So I'm wondering, could you tell us, like, this is sort of the dream, like, let's say Metro became fareless, tomorrow. What would that look like for other SAGE members and for people in your community? Like, how would their mobility change?
Pues no soy organizadora de SAGE.
Well, I'm not necessarily a SAGE organizer. I'm a member. I'm a community member, but I'm advocating on behalf of the community. And how would I be affected if there were fareless transit? Well, it would be to my benefit that I would not have to walk as much, and because sometimes I have to walk often, like when I take my children to school, I'd rather pay for the bus and go with them to get there on time. But then on my way back, I prefer to save the 175 for the next day, because that 175, I could get a bite to eat, some food on my way. And if I had to spend that 175, I just wouldn't be able to make ends meet at the end of the month. But if fares were eliminated, it would benefit me so much, because I wouldn't have to be figuring out, should I go walking or not? Like, what should I do? I wouldn't have to think, I wouldn't have to choose whether to buy food or take the bus. And I think a lot of people would think the same. It would be to my benefit, because I wouldn't have to pay for my children's fares. And you might say, oh, but your children are students, they qualify for discounts. There's people who don't qualify. I don't qualify for a discount. My husband makes over the threshold, but that doesn't mean that I can afford the bus. So sometimes I have to cut costs in food purchases or any other spending throughout the week to be able to afford that fare for my children. And if we didn't have bus fares, if it were free, I just wouldn't feel limited in that way. And yeah, it's frustrating to think of that.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel.
And sometimes, my husband won't let me use, I may be able to use his car, but it's not always feasible, and gas is expensive at this point. But yeah, it just implies a lot of things. So I'm always advocating for transit to be fareless. And it would help me a lot to have fareless transit, because I just wouldn't have to limit myself from purchasing something that I need for the week. So if I buy 2 gallons of milk, then I might have to forego those if I need to spend more on transit. So I'd have to be like calculating that.
Para mí. Y pienso que otras
Yeah.
familias
Thank you,
les
Isabel, for
pasaría lo mismo.
sharing all that. And one thing you brought up a lot of good things. I think a lot of people have a similar situation, right, where they're being forced to kind of make these difficult choices every day about whether to spend on transit or on something else that they need. And, you know, that shouldn't be a reality that we're creating for people. And I'm also glad that you brought up some of the discount programs like the Life program, because while those do help some people, we know that some people make a little too much money to qualify. And like you said, that doesn't mean that they can easily afford transit. And even for people who do qualify for those programs, we know that a lot of people who qualify don't end up getting into them just because of the barriers of having to apply and show different, you know, types of proof. So thank you so much for bringing up those different issues. And we are a little bit low on time, so I'm just going to ask this question, not to everyone, but to whoever wants to answer it first. And that's just, where do you think we go next in terms of winning a fareless system? You know, what do you think is the most important step? And for everyone here who's on the call, what do you think we need to do next?
¿Responderé yo eso?
I can respond to that.
Yes.
Well, what do we do next? We need to gather the community, and we need to advocate for fareless transit for everyone with no exceptions, be it adults, children, students, whoever it is. You know, that we don't have to get angry and yell at the bus rider for not letting us in, for not having a quarter, right? Sometimes I don't have enough and the bus driver gets mad at me. And I said, hey, I paid at least $1. I'm not gonna walk today, right? So that's what we would have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. That was a really good wrap up. That fareless is something that would really benefit all of us. And with that, we're going to wrap up the panel. Thank you so much to the three of you for participating. And I'm going to hand it back for us to wrap up.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me fine? Yeah? All right, cool. So this was a lot of great information and a lot of important information. So what's next is we would like to invite you guys for a couple of things. Some are in person, some are just as simple as a click. And we can all, as Isabel said, unite together in all these events. So one of these things could be signing our advocacy letter, which we will be submitting on July 27th on the Metro Board meeting with Mayor Bass as the new chair. And I'll be dropping that link right here so you guys can sign on. It's simple, quick, and again, this message is all about uniting us together. We all want the same thing, and it's great to see support for community members and just transit and public transportation in general. The next thing would be the Cicla Via event happening June 18th. I'll be there. If you guys want to come say hi, amazing. If you guys don't want to say hi to me, there's other people. We're going to have a table there and just come have fun. It's like an event where we could celebrate us and the community and just everybody. Go carless for a while, you know, have fun. July 20th is a Metro Executive Committee meeting. And then July 27th, again, connection with the first one is Metro Board meeting with Mayor Bass as new chair. I'll probably be at all of them, so I'm hoping I see a lot of you there. And I'm excited to meet all of you in person and talk more with you guys. And this is all great information. I think like if we start small step, find something. It might not mean like a lot right now to you, but together it means a lot. So I think we should all come together and just, celebrate us, celebrate community, celebrate the possibility of fairness transportation system for everybody. Thank you for everybody who attended and the interpretation and the participants. And with that, that's my closing part. I don't know if anybody has anything else to say, but let me put the link for the ciclovia. This is it right there. It's from 9 to 4 p.m. So just come, stop by, say hi. I think that's, oh yeah. Yeah. That does it for my part.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone for joining. We hope that folks got a great deep dive into the report. Any other information that y'all were curious about around fareless transit. Thank you for setting aside the time to be here. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and Instagram, All for Transit or Act Los Angeles, and also Sage_Shift Power, Sage South LA, to keep up with the work that we're doing. Like Alejandro mentioned, we have some cool stuff coming up this summer, and especially getting to the Metro Board meeting for July. So we hope that folks can be there and support.